Is NATO ready for war? That's what we will discuss today in this exciting online event here at CSIS. I'm Max Bergmann, the director of the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program here at CSIS. In just 4 weeks' time, NATO leaders will convene in the heat and humidity here in Washington in mid-July for the Alliance's 75th anniversary summit. It will be our birthday. But following Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, there's also a lot of work that NATO has to do. 2 years ago, NATO adopted a Back to the Future strategy of forward defense and deterrence at the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid. And to follow through, allies committed to a range of measures. So how is NATO doing? Is NATO ready for war? Minutes ago, we released a report assessing NATO's progress and analyzing whether NATO is indeed ready for a protracted conflict. I'm delighted to be joined by some of the authors of that report, Dr. John Deni, and two of the authors, Dr. Cynthia Cook and Sean Monaghan, to discuss the report and its findings. Before jumping into the conversation, let me run through their bios very quickly. Dr. John Deni, who's right across from me, is the research professor of security studies at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. Dr. Deni has long been with the U.S. Army War College. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center and an adjunct lecturer at the American University's School of International Service. And I should say, and he'll say it himself, but his views just represent himself and not the Department of Defense or the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Cynthia Cook, to my left, is the director of our Defense Industrial Initiatives Group and senior fellow with the International Security Program. And Sean Monaghan is visiting fellow with my program, the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. Sean is a UK Ministry of Defense official seconded here to CSIS for another year. Sean has been here for a long time, and we're sad that he will depart, but we fortunately have until 2025. You will never depart. But Sean, maybe I'll start with you. Sure. So what does your report say? It's been 2 years since the Madrid summit, since the new strategic concept, which sort of outlines a new strategy for the alliance. Where are we as we head into NATO's 75th anniversary summit?
Thanks, Max. Appreciate it. And I should also say I'm only speaking here today on behalf of myself and no one else, not CSIS and not the UK Ministry of Defence. But first to say thank you for the opportunity to talk about this report. We're really excited about it. It's been a product of a lot of hard work the past few weeks. I'm really excited to be talking about this with Cynthia and John, two great colleagues whose work in this area I really admire, and I know we'll have a lot to say today on this question of whether NATO is ready for war. And as you've hinted at, I think the release of the report today, this week, is really timely because we're exactly a month away, actually a month yesterday, from the Washington summit, the 75th anniversary summit. And also this week, NATO defence ministers will be meeting in Brussels on Thursday and Friday to preview NATO's progress ahead of the summit, to talk about NATO's progress in enhancing its deterrence and defence, and that's what our report is about. So I hope they'll all be paying attention and maybe reading our report, and it will be interesting to compare our report and the judgment of the NATO defence ministers later this week. So to give you the headline first, I suppose, and then I'll unpack the report, and we have a few charts from the report which will come up on the screen, and Cynthia will take over and talk about some of the kind of deeper, longer term aspects of our analysis. The headline is NATO ready for war? Our finding is that yes, NATO is ready to fight tonight, as it were, in a way that it hasn't been in the last 2 years. A lot of work has gone on in the alliance to improve NATO's deterrence and defence and readiness for war. But NATO's maybe not ready for a protracted war. So, any serious conflict between NATO and Russia is likely to be a protracted war. We've seen protracted war in Ukraine as we speak. We know what that looks like. NATO still has a lot of work to do on that front. So, how did we reach this conclusion? Well, as you suggested, Max, we looked at the commitments that allies made in Madrid at the summit 2 years ago when they launched a new strategic concept which was refocused on deterrence and forward defence. And we used publicly available information. We talked to NATO officials. We held workshops with allied representatives, national representatives and experts to look at the progress against each of the Madrid goals. 2 points to make before I go into the Madrid goals and bring up some charts. Number one, this is a provocative title, Is NATO Ready for War? We owe some thanks to the UK Parliament did a similar review of the UK Ministry of Defence's readiness for war. It's called Is UK MOD Ready for War? And their findings were quite similar. Yes, but maybe not a long war. A lot of work still to do there. But what kind of war? So Clausewitz's advice to every statesperson was to understand first and foremost the kind of war you're going to embark on. What our kind of assumption is around the most dangerous scenario here is a fait accompli, a Russian, the kind of so-called Narva scenario, where Russia foments there's ethnic Russians in the Estonian city of Narva, foments an uprising, perhaps a lightning or blitzkrieg strike on Narva or on the capital, on Tallinn or in Riga, as we saw Russia attempted to do in Ukraine, on Kiev. That failed, obviously. And John has actually written about this, the Suwalki gap, the gap between the 60-kilometer gap between Belarus, a Russian client state for all intents and purposes, and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which would separate the Baltics from Poland and the rest of NATO. So we're not talking about hybrid war, we're not talking about nuclear war, although there are elements of nuclear escalation and nuclear coercion that come into play, but we're really focused on the conventional fait accompli scenario and denying that. So how's NATO doing? Let me pull up the first chart, which is about defence spending. Great. So NATO allies, particularly European allies, and we talk about burden sharing and the European pillar in NATO, have really been spending a lot more money on defence since 2014, the annexation of Crimea, and particularly since 2022. And this chart shows non-US, so European-only defence expenditure, and that has almost skyrocketed. We have Poland spending upwards of 4%, the Baltic states spending 3%, many others spending 2.5%. Across NATO allies now, an average of allies are spending on average 2% of their GDP taken as a whole across the alliance. So in a way, the burden sharing question can be put to bed. I'm sure it won't be, but a lot of progress made. Still a long way to go. The 2% target probably isn't enough, and we can talk about that afterwards, but a lot of progress on defence spending. Next, let me talk about enhanced forward presence, allied forward forces. So as you mentioned, Max, the strategic concept is all about forward defence. NATO increased its forward missions, enhanced forward presence missions, from 4 to 8 after Russia's invasion. And you can see them here. Let me just zoom in on this map here.
And I should say that these charts are also in the report. So if you're straining your eyes on a YouTube screen or on a phone, you can also just download the report as well. Exactly.
How convenient we make it for you. And I should also say this map is from NATO. It's actually 2 years out of date, but it shows the 8 missions along the eastern flank of of NATO allies. And it also shows enhanced maritime and air presence alongside the forward land forces. Let me move over to this table here, talking of forward land forces. So in Madrid, allies agreed to, they have 8 battle group size missions, so that's up to about 1,000 troops, and they're multinational, and each one is led by a particular nation, an ally, and you can see that in the left-hand column. There was a commitment to scale those up to brigade level, so up to 5,000 troops, where and when required. And this is our assessment of the second column from the left, whether battle group has been exercised. All of the missions have exercised at battle group level. The middle column, 4 of the 8 missions have been exercised, reinforced to brigade level. So that's up to 5,000 troops. And then 2 of the 8 have concrete plans in place, and that's the Canadian-led mission in Latvia and the German-led mission in Lithuania have concrete plans in place to permanently base forward a brigade level, multinational brigade level troop presence.
They have plans, but
they have plans to do it by 26 in Latvia, 27 in Lithuania, I believe. So that's forward forces. So then we move on to NATO force model, and I commend on this Dr. John Deni's report, and look forward to hearing about from him on this subject. But NATO has a new force model, which you can see in this diagram is taken from John's report, so thanks to him for that. Previously, NATO's high-readiness forces, NATO allies were preparing to deploy and did in fact deploy in 2022 40,000 personnel under the NATO response force. In Madrid 2 years ago, they upped that to 300,000 within 30 days, so that's a tier 1 and the tier 2. And let me just try and draw on this. You can see here, so that's 300,000 in 30 days. That's a massive increase on the previous target, 7-fold increase. And then within 180 days, up to 500,000 with it. So that's total 800,000 up to 6 months. So it's difficult to exactly judge whether NATO's met this. NATO officials have said they've met this, but at the same time, the chief of the military committee, Admiral Bauer, US Admiral Bauer, has said there are some challenges on readiness, on the quality of forces, and on matching the forces that allies are making available to the regional plans. Regional plans I'll talk about next. So command and control, one of the biggest things NATO has done in the past 2 years is stand up a new joint force command and introduce regional plans. So let me unpack that, and this map shows that. I must say that the map is illustrative only, it's not official in any way. It indicates the 3 regions on which NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who's in charge of NATO's operations, is planning. And General Cavoli has 3 regions: the Northwest region, the European Arctic, Northern Europe, the Central region, Central Europe, and then Southern Europe. And each of those regional plans has a joint force command that runs operations in those regions. So Northwest Europe is in Norfolk, in the USA, not Norfolk, England, a bit of a backwater. A lovely place though. Central Europe is Brunsum in Netherlands, and Southern Europe is in Naples in Italy. And NATO has done there's been a lot of work to get those joint force commands up to scratch. Earlier this year, exercise Steadfast Defender, which I'll talk about in a second, NATO's biggest ever exercise, was commanded by JFC Norfolk for a whole month to prove JFC Norfolk's readiness. So that's the regional plans and command structure. I mentioned exercising. Over the last 2 years, NATO has conducted a number, has really increased the scale and intensity of its high-level, high-end collective defence exercising. On the screen here is an example of NATO's Steadfast Defender, NATO's biggest ever exercise, which is just wrapped up, which featured up to 90,000 personnel across all of NATO's operating area. Last year, Exercise Air Defender in Germany was the biggest Allied air exercise. NATO's really stepped up its collective defence exercise game. Next, I'll hand over to Cynthia to talk about defence industry.
Oh, thanks, Sean. Happy to talk about the defense industrial base and to report some good news and some bad news. The good news is that policymakers are finally giving the defense industrial base the attention that it deserves. The bad news is the reason for this, which is the difficulty in supporting Ukraine in its self-defense against Russia's illegal invasion. That support revealed some challenges in production capacity and the ability to surge in its production. So this is now a well-understood problem. And to address this at Vilnius, the Allies called for the removal of barriers to defense trade and to make investments to invest in the resiliency of the defense industrial base. The NATO Defense Production Action Plan was unveiled, which highlights priorities for aggregating demand to accelerate production, to increase capacity, and perhaps most importantly, to improve interoperability and the ability of the Allies to work together. So there has been some progress in terms of what industry looks for. There's even been some investments. Since 2023, the NATO Support and Procurement Agency issued contracts for munitions, for the procurement of Patriot missiles, and for artillery shells. The Allies have improved multinational capability cooperation, including in the multi-role tanker transport capability air fleet, which achieved initial operating capability, or IOC. So we do see some progress. What we see on this chart is that traditional European producers have increased defense trade within Europe, which can lead to efficiencies, to enhanced coordination and cooperation, and to increased interoperability. This chart also highlights that Poland's all-source importation strategy has boosted arms trade for the continent more generally. The EU has allocated funds for this, including over 500 million euro to ramp up ammunition production, and it's also reduced its own defense industrial strategy, so there's work on multiple fronts. But there are still some ongoing challenges. Changes in the defense industrial base do take time. There's a lot of heritage systems and heritage production methods and other constraints, so it might take a decade or more. But so it does need continued sustained attention by leaders, and the alliance would still benefit from greater integration, consolidation, and increase in capacity. Next chart, please, Sean. So why is this important? It's important because it's what the defense industrial base produces, which is critical warfighting capabilities. And if you look at the numbers, NATO's cumulative collective capabilities exceed those of Russia, even when you exclude the big beast that is the United States. That's shown on this slide, which offers two specific comparisons. We can see that 2 years of war in Ukraine have degraded Russia's armed forces, as its fleet of active main battle tanks has decreased by 41%, and its number of active duty personnel have fallen by 20%. And NATO does have more modern equipment than Russia. If we look at when its aircraft were produced, 71% of NATO's combat air fleet was produced after 1990, compared to only 53% of Russia's. However, this does not necessarily represent the full picture or translate to the battlefield, and you have to go deeper than static numbers to look at trends. NATO has capability gaps and readiness challenges which undermine the conventional deterrence. NATO's number of combat vehicles, in-service main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored reconnaissance vehicles, and self-propelled artillery have remained static or fallen since 2014, and European nations have gaps in naval forces, air enablers, air defense, and battle decisive munitions. So there have been significant investments in NATO capabilities since 2014, as the numbers that Sean showed pointed out, but there is more progress that needs to be made. So something of a mixed story here. Next chart, please. The last topic is really one of my favorites, which is the issue of resilience, which ties together many of the topics that we've talked about today. Resilience refers to the capacity to prepare for, resist, respond to, and quickly recover from all sorts of shocks and disruptions. It incorporates military capacity, civil preparedness, and emergency planning, and it was NATO's first line of defense against the Soviet Union. In fact, I pulled some old NATO report covers from its earlier days, which shows that resilience has been a pretty persistent consideration for NATO planners. There's also been the good news is that there's been some new investments and new thinking since Madrid. In October 2022, NATO established a resilience committee. In 2023, in March, they established a task force on the resilience of critical infrastructure to look at energy, transportation, digital infrastructure, and space. And it pulled together a final report with some 14 specific recommendations. At Vilnius, NATO launched a new maritime center for the security of critical underwater infrastructure. The Vilnius communique emphasized societal resilience, health systems, supply chain, and energy security. The Allies also agreed to resilience objectives and to create a new baseline for planning. So a lot of really good thinking has happened, but of course we have recommendations for even more. The Resilience Committee could consider a resilience fund and a resilience advisory group, and really risk assessments, because you can manage what you measure. If they're regularly assessing risks, they'll have the work underway to prioritize where they should be putting their investments. Now, resilience is a national responsibility, but it does benefit from collective action. So there is a real reason for NATO allies, EU allies, to work together on this and coordinate. And also that our new NATO members, Finland and Sweden, have lessons from all of societal resilience that can be drawn on by other allies as they plan their way forward. But really the bottom line for warfighting resilience is the allies have to find the will to fight. Ukraine has shown that this is really the foundation of self-defense.
Great.
Thanks, Cynthia. Maybe I could just wrap up very briefly, Max. I mean, where does all this leave us? Well, I go back to what I said at the start, is that our assessment is that NATO is ready to fight tonight, thanks to all of this great work that's been done over the last 2 years. One aspect we haven't mentioned is, of course, NATO has 2 new allies, Finland and Sweden, which is arguably the biggest thing that has happened to NATO in the past 2 years. Once we got over all the kind of political drama, if you like, and those allies were both acceded, the act of integrating them within NATO's regional plans and within NATO's planning, capability development and operational structures has been absolutely seamless. Thanks, Finland and Sweden had a very close relationship with NATO for many years, and thanks to that close relationship, thanks to their advanced, modern, capable forces, that already use NATO doctrine, that's been absolutely seamless. So, this leaves us in a very good place, but with a lot of work to do. As Cynthia mentioned, defence spending, defence industry, critical capabilities and societal resilience are really required, more work required to be ready for a protracted war. And if I may, one final chart. Of course, this isn't easy. NATO allies can't just do more of everything. There's always a trade-off, right? Yes. And in defence strategy, there's a kind of iron law, an iron triangle, if you like, this trade-off between force structure, capacity, force readiness to fight tonight, and then modernization, readiness to fight tomorrow. And at the end of the report, this chart that's on the screen now, we try and capture this as a trade-off for NATO allies between force depth, prepared for protraction at the top, everything that Cynthia just spoke about, combat readiness, the ability to fight tonight. So all of Poland's massive investment, for example, in its land forces, in thousands of tanks and artillery, will help NATO fight tonight. And then modernization. The UK, for example, is committed to becoming a science and technology superpower and is really focused on the long-term modernization. Allies need all of these, and of course there's always a trade-off. None of this is easy.
I love that last chart, Sean, and in part because it's so easy to criticize the force planners of the past for the gaps and shortfalls we see today. But they're always faced with looking at these trade-offs and making decisions. And if they're prioritizing modernization, those priorities, that prioritization have meant that we don't have enough munitions today. But I don't think we expected the length of this war and the impact it's had on magazine depth.
I want to get into maybe some of the practicalities in a second, but and maybe sort of challenge some of the numbers that NATO is putting out. But John, let me turn to you first, and maybe you could talk about NATO's evolution here a little bit and the new force model and what NATO announced at Madrid, going from 40,000 to 300,000, and how you sort of see the current sort of force structure and where you see NATO kind of on this path to meeting some of the goals that outlined 2 years ago.
Well, Max, thanks. And thanks to CSIS for inviting me down to join you all here today. It's a real pleasure. I appreciate you mentioning the disclaimer. I won't repeat that, but my views are my own. I was talking to Sean and Cynthia before we started here today about their study and the fact that I had referred 2 interns that I'm working with this summer to the study. And so I really want to commend it to all of your viewers here. It's an excellent work. It really covers from soup to nuts all the kinds of things that you would need to think about in terms of answering the question of whether NATO is really indeed ready to fight tonight or ready for large-scale combat operations. And so it's excellent from that perspective. I agree with most of the findings insofar as I can comment on them. The breadth of the study is impressive, and I can't comment on all of it. But in terms of NATO's force model, and so the big moving pieces, right, the forces they'll use, the readiness they've built up, I tend to think of this binning this into 4 different areas. First is the force organization. And here we see the alliance really expanding, as Sean noted, going from the NATO response force, relatively small, tens of thousands, up to the new force model across 3 tiers, hundreds of thousands of troops, right? Now, we can debate, and I think Sean and Cynthia's study does a good job of diving into the weeds of examining whether and how those tiers are really all they're cracked up to be. We know, for example, through some of the research that's been done to date, including in my own study, that in terms of Tier 1, NATO probably has most of that force covered, and that's mostly because they're comprised of in-place forces, right? Poland's army is the in-place force for the Tier 1 portion of the defense plan of Northeastern Europe. Tier 2, Tier 3, the forces get bigger in size, and they get heavier in composition. Mm-hmm. And here the Allies continue to struggle. Mm-hmm. With regard to the Allied response force, we've seen pretty good responses, we've heard, from the Allies in fulfilling those requirements, but we know that some of the enablers, some of the niche capabilities probably won't be there in the numbers they need to be. Now, that won't prevent the Alliance from declaring that force combat credible at next month's summit. But that means, if it's combat credible and it still lacks some niche capabilities, they're taking on increased risk, okay? So force organization is the first category. Next, I think of this in terms of force management, right? Once we've identified these 3 tiers and the ARF, the Allied Response Force, can they meet the timelines? Do the Allies have the ability to do that? And here I think there are ongoing doubts about the rigor with which NATO is going to apply its yardstick, right? Will we see, for example, snap exercises, no-notice inspections of military facilities, visits to staffs at the last minute, no notice, to try to get an understanding of what their thinking is about whether they're ready and where their forces are deployed. The rigor that we need to see there, I think that's still a work in progress. The third category is with command and control, or really NATO's force, its command structure and its force structure. And here, I think that chart that you all depicted showing the different JFCs and their relative areas of responsibility makes great sense. I think there are some, like myself, that have some concerns about whether JFC Norfolk is really the right answer for the Arctic, Northern Europe, and Scandinavia. I've been arguing for a JFC in perhaps the other Norfolk, in the UK. The UK's
Northwood.
The UK's, well, that could be a place too, right? Take advantage of the existing NATO headquarters, use those as the kernel of a 4th JFC. But that's just not in the cards right now. And so I think what we're going to see is NATO using Norfolk and Brunssum to some degree as they sort of feel their way toward an acceptable interim outcome. But I think increased risk. And I think the alliance is wrestling now with how to manage that over the next few years, while the Russian ground forces, at least, have been diminished. We've got a window of opportunity. Maybe the alliance will take advantage of it.
Let me ask, and this is for everyone. The question is NATO ready for war? Should we subdivide the question? Because I think it's pretty clear the United States military is ready for war and is prepared, and the U.S. forces that are in Europe are ready for war, or at least I hope they are, and hopefully U.S. forces around the world. But I think the larger question is, are the European forces that are part of NATO ready? And how do you think about that question? Because we see all the articles about in the German press or other European papers about their forces not being up to snuff, not being able to deploy a brigade to the Baltic states in time. Do we need to subdivide this between the U.S. and our European partners on the ground, or in Canadian as well?
Yeah, I think we all have thoughts on this. I'm happy to start. And Max, actually, the last conversation we had in this room was on the European pillar of NATO, and I encourage your viewers to go and look at that if they're really interested in in this topic, and you've written a lot about this as well. I go back to the chart earlier. I mean, European nations have really increased their defence spending and their political focus on defence. I mean, the UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps made a speech a few months ago, which told the UK and Europe we're in a pre-war situation. I mean, that's a complete change in rhetoric, and it's the political rhetoric, political prioritisation that has to come before the resources, and then down the line after the resources, the capability development, then the force structure, and then the readiness for war. So, there's a big lagging. There's a big lag in the system here. The big picture is that since the end of the Cold War, European nations have disinvested in defence, and rightly so. I mean, the end of the Cold War, there was a peace dividend, and everybody spent their money on butter rather than guns, and we all had this debate.
Or healthcare, roads, transportation infrastructure,
all of that good stuff. But that's because the threat environment was relatively benign at the time, and there's always those who are warning of the imminent threat. Now, 2 decades on, the picture has completely changed, and I think European nations really realised that. They began to realise that in 2007, 2008, Putin's Munich speech, invasion of Georgia, the Estonian cyber attacks, really drove it home in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, and that's when defence spending and the political rhetoric kind of changed. So Europe's getting there. There's still a burden-sharing question, but as I said earlier, that's been answered to a large extent. We've seen the likes of Poland is developing the largest land force in Europe, if not the world, towards 250,000, certainly in Europe. And many other nations are doing similar. A lot of gaps remain. A lot of, this is a journey. We're not the final destination, but I think great strides have been made.
I would add that the peace dividend was a happy time. I certainly lived through it, and it just seemed that the strategic environment had changed. So it took a while for everybody to wake up to the back to the future environment that we find ourselves in now. And just having looked at this over time, it really has been quite a remarkable reawakening. But just in terms of making the investments, increasing the investments, building capacity, building capability, there's going to be a lag. And that's why it's important to remember that even if there's a peace dividend in the future, there has to be attention paid continuously on investing in defense, because without it, it's just too hard to surge rapidly when the time is when it's needed. And the goal of all these investments is not to fight Russia. The goal is to ensure that NATO is strong enough to be able to deter future attacks after Ukraine.
Peace through strength.
Exactly.
If that's the measure, I think the alliance has largely succeeded then. I mean, right, we can look at the absence of evidence may not be evidence of the fact that they have succeeded, but certainly they've done fairly well in deterring the worst case scenario when it comes to the Russians. Of course, there's lots of hybrid activity that we haven't been able to deter, right? Both in the cyber realm, but also in terms of sabotage, even assassination teams from Russia across Europe sent to kill political opponents. But Max, I have real serious doubts about the direction of travel is right. But if we look at the trend lines over time and the key countries that matter, that can bring mass to the table, right? All these allies are important, but let's face it, only some of them, a handful, can really field brigades and divisions. And that's what we need in an era of large-scale combat operations, or LISCO, another great Pentagon acronym. In that sense, as I mentioned, the direction of travel is right. If you look at the first chart Sean put up about defense spending, right, that's going in the right direction. And we're going to hear great things about burden sharing next month at the summit here, right? Yes. But we need to ask ourselves, what's the long-term trend? I can think of, for example, the German example, the $100 billion Zeitenwende fund. Fantastic, gets them over 2%. But there's no plan for funding beyond the 4-year timeline of that 100 billion euros. Other allies are in the same boat, right? We could think of the Brits, the French, the Italians, the Germans. Together, the 4 of them account for 2/3 of European NATO defense spending. If they're not rising in defense spending and rising quickly, the alliance is going to remain frustrated in its pursuit of both capacity and capability. So for now, I think in the short run, the Americans do play an absolutely vital role in providing the backbone to NATO's deterrent posture and maintaining its ability to deter the Russians.
Let me ask sort of, I guess, the elephant in the room question about Ukraine and Ukraine support. Because, you know, in seeing the chart of all the armed vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles that are possessed by NATO partners, you know, part of me is like, why do we have those? Get those to Ukraine as fast as possible. And is there a tension between supporting Ukraine and preparing NATO for conflict? It strikes me, you know, there's lots of reports at the entry into this, or as Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, that you know, Germany had 2 or 3 days of artillery in the event of a conventional conflict. I think the UK doesn't have that much more than that. I don't think those numbers, those stockpiles have improved in part because whatever is being produced is going to Ukraine. So is there a tension between supporting Ukraine and NATO readiness? And how should we think about that tension? Cynthia, maybe start with you, at least from a defense industrial perspective.
Well, the Ukraine shows the demand signal. You know, it shows what is needed. The forces there are going through ammunition at a rapid rate. It's just they do face some challenges in terms of making sure that they're getting the support they need to continue fighting. So from NATO minus the US's perspective, yeah, send as much as you can to the front line as soon as possible. The US has its concerns in the South China Sea, which will require to hold back some of this support, but the European nations, you know, Russia's not going away. So support is really very critical. And if the Allies don't support Ukraine over the long term, what message does that send to Russia and to other challenging states across the world? It's not a good story. The story is, well, we gave them a couple years with support, but you know, then we got tired of it. So I'm sorry. So that support does need to be continuous, and really the opportunities for investment in new capabilities and replacing the old equipment, in making investments in the industrial base so that it's more efficient and modern. It's not like it's good news that this is an opportunity on the backs of the Ukrainian people and of Ukraine, but for the sacrifice they are making, the best thing that the Allies could do is to stand up and continue to support them and to make the hard choices they have in their own economies. Yeah, you may have to give up one of your own defense factories in order to enhance efficiency and to get more modern capabilities. But compared to what Ukraine is sacrificing, that seems like a small price to pay.
I mean, hopefully the demand signal sent by Ukraine, the demand signal of needing to ramp up production to boost our own reserves would lead to increased production. But I'm curious when it comes to at least reserve equipment. A lot of the Eastern European states or former Warsaw Pact countries gave away a lot of their old Soviet equipment. So do NATO European members, are they kind of lacking some of the equipment reserves that might have been there at least 2-3 years ago? And does that require perhaps that spending line to maybe go up even more in terms of what the demands may be?
Max, I think there is a challenge here, a problem. There's not only the competing demand signal of Ukraine with what NATO is asking these countries to do now for the new operations plans that have been approved, but there's also the national defense responsibilities, right? I mean, there's really three three demand signals: their own national requirements, the NATO requirement for NATO ops plans, and the Ukraine supply effort. For example, we could think of the French. They have the Olympics coming up next month, right? And the military is going to be saddled with or tasked with some defense duties, homeland security duties there. So all of these things are pressuring all of our allies in Europe. In fact, we know it's an issue because Secretary General Stoltenberg spoke about it just a few weeks ago. He said in public, speaking to NATO allies, hey, if you're faced with this tension between aiding Ukraine and fulfilling NATO's operations plans, aid Ukraine. So he's tried to make it clear that Ukraine has to be the short-run priority. And the reason for that is exactly as you described. And as, incidentally, a colleague, a friend of all of ours, Dr. Lisa Aronson and I are discovering in some of our own research, the allies, most of them are out of what they can provide to Ukraine. Now, there are some exceptions there, right? I mean, this is a judgment call. It's a political, a Paul Mill decision made by these countries in terms of their threat perceptions, of how much they can give, how much they can dip down into their stocks before they've hit too great of a risk, right? So there are exceptions, but many of them have reached the bottom of their ability to give more. And the challenge that we face is, as Cynthia was describing, she knows better than I do with regard to defense industry, decisions made a couple decades ago, we're now reaping the costs of those decisions in terms of downsizing production lines, in terms of not rationalizing European defense. Why do 8 European countries still make main battle tanks? These are all sort of the penalties we're paying today for poorly made decisions over the last couple of decades. And the Ukrainians are frankly bearing the brunt of that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Max, this is a critical question, and we're going to see this play out in 4 weeks' time at the Washington summit, where top of the agenda will be Ukraine. And I expect NATO to announce a significant package of support for Ukraine. We could talk about it if you want. We'll be short of membership, but it will be significant. And the second agenda item will be everything we've been talking about today, is NATO's own defense and deterrence. In a way, as you suggested, these are trade-offs, right? And we could add it, I'm thinking of our iron triangle here, we could make it an iron square, and we could add another kind of point of trade-off. I see that as mutually reinforcing. I mean, NATO allies supporting Ukraine is bolstering their own defense and deterrence, because as Cynthia eloquently described, Ukraine is fighting off Russia. That is keeping NATO and NATO citizens safe. Ukraine's sacrifice is keeping them safe. NATO's investment, that's the business case argument. At the same time, an investment in NATO's own defense and deterrence is also an investment in Ukraine's security, because if NATO allies feel safe, they feel like they can aid Ukraine without fear of reprisal from Russia. And we see this escalation, incrementalism at play on a daily basis. So for me, rather than a trade-off, the two are mutually reinforcing. As Cynthia has said, there's an opportunity here which NATO allies, I think, are very much taking to get rid of their old stocks, give them to Ukraine. Ukraine has this MacGyver force. It's using whatever it can get. And for NATO to then backfill with more modern equipment. We've seen that. We produced a report last year on European air defense. A lot of the old Soviet-era equipment has been gifted to Ukraine. NATO allies are developing, buying more modern systems, NASAMS, Patriot, and other systems. I mean, European NATO is still far short. I saw a headline, I'm not sure exactly how accurate it was the other day. European allies, I think it was in the Financial Times, only have 5% of the air defence. It didn't say whether that was platforms or interceptors or what, but 5% of the air defence they need in a high-end conflict scenario. So there's some gaps there, but there's an opportunity for modernisation, going back to our iron triangle.
Let me dive into that iron triangle for a second, because I think Cynthia, you rightly noted, it's sort of all, I always sort of would look at sort of long-term Pentagon planning war of the future 20 years out. How could you possibly know what is around the corner? I guess the question I have is that, at least when it comes to Europe, for the United States, we're focused on China. There's essentially an arms technological race where we're trying to always improve our technology to have an edge on any adversary. But if you're in Europe and you're looking at Russia as your main adversary that is now bogged down in a war where Russia, are pulling out older systems, they're retrofitting older classes of tanks from the Soviet period, who your adversary is, at least, over the next 10 years. And Does it make sense to really focus a lot on modernization, building the tank of the future, when you know maybe your Leopard 2 tank actually can defeat the most modern Russian tank right now? So should Europeans maybe put more of the focus less on the future and more on the present and what they could actually build now?
I would say that there's not necessarily a trade-off if we think flexibly. I mean, you can have a heritage battle tank that's outfitted with more modern counter-UAS capabilities. The important thing is to remember that through approaches like open architecture, you can have weapon systems that can be more readily upgraded to deal with the threat of today. Ukraine does offer a test bed of new capabilities, and it not only is Ukraine adapting, but Russia's adapting too. So that sort of point counterpoint process can be looked at for lessons in terms of how you have to stay flexible and turn on a dime to make needed investments.
Yeah, I think NATO has to do everything, but luckily NATO now has 32 allies. And the point of the regional plans is that NATO should divide and conquer. They shouldn't all focus on the same thing. And they should design their defence strategies first and foremost around what are their obligations in NATO's regional plans. What have they agreed to NATO and to their allies to provide? So, I haven't seen the plans, but presumably Poland has some agreement to provide a large land force, a large army, lots of heavy armour. It's buying hundreds of Abrams off the US, it's buying hundreds of K2 off-the-shelf tanks from South Korea. It's buying hundreds of K9 artillery systems from South Korea. Other allies can do different things, bring different things to the party. I mentioned the UK, for example. The UK is heavily invested in emerging technology, quantum computing, in cyber and space, and NATO's regional plans also, by the way, have domain-specific plans, and they have a plan for NATO in space. They have a plan for NATO in cyberspace. So I think a division of labour, which was how NATO was conceived at the very outset in 1949, 75 years ago. It was cooperation, a division of labour, the most economically and militarily efficient division of labour between all of the allies. The final point I'd make on this is that we think about Russian reconstitution, and there's lots of opinions on, and Russia's army is now bigger than it was before Ukraine, but clearly less capable. Then there's NATO's reconstitution, which is essentially what we're talking about today, NATO's strengthening of its own defence and deterrence. What matters is the relative speed between those two things. So you can't consider Russian reconstitution on its own, you can't consider NATO reconstitution on its own. And NATO's reconstitution of its deterrence and defence is about mass, because Russia has a very big army and very capable strategic forces in air and navy, space too. But it's also about quality and technology, because in 10 years' time you want overmatch. You don't want to buy all off-the-shelf stuff now that in 10, 15 years' time is going to be overmatched by your adversary.
So what you're buying is an outcome of the industrial base. So setting that demand signal and getting it right and encouraging industry to invest in advanced manufacturing, digital engineering, additive manufacturing, can enable them to produce those capabilities that the forces will need to fight in the future. And in terms of the Iron Triangle, I wrote a piece last year that looked at how the industrial base has traditionally been judged, which is cost, schedule, performance, which gets kind of aligns with the triangle you showed earlier. What I would argue is that we need cost, schedule, performance, and resilience to be featured in our thinking of the industrial base. So how can we make those investments that don't necessarily reward the low-cost producer that is disinvesting from surge capacity, but instead allows decision makers to really focus on making additional investments for long-term capacity and surge.
And to briefly add to that, the Alliance's edge in a way is innovation, and that's why you've seen since Madrid a real focus on innovation. Diana, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, the North Atlantic Accelerator Programme that's based in Estonia and in London is about connecting NATO allies with innovative industrial players, and has $1 billion of funding behind it to really focus on that innovation, which is going to win you the war.
And the EU, I think, is also now essentially the third largest or fourth largest, if you include the UK, in terms of investor in defense, research and defense, or research and development. But maybe back to the regional plans. I mean, we're sort of pointing out, well, at least I am, I'm pointing out, what about this problem, what about that problem? But it does strike me also that there's been a lot of investment actually over the last 20 years in air power. And you look at, especially, the Scandinavian militaries, and they, I think, have more than 200 fourth and fifth gen fighters. And we're not really thinking that much about air power. I think it's not front of the mind for the news media in particular, because we're not seeing that necessarily play out on the battlefield, although recently the Russian Air Force has become more of a factor. How does air power and naval power play into this? Because that strikes me where there's a strong NATO advantage. I mean, there's a NATO advantage when you include the U.S., I think, on the ground side, but particularly when it comes to Air Force and naval capacity on the European side.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I'd love to hear the Army War College talk about naval and air power. Just thinking back to our map of the regional plans, Max, we were very particular to make sure the regions covered the sea. At one point we had all the nations coloured in, but you look at a map and you think ground forces. But the regional plans specifically include plans for every domain, for the maritime domain, for the air domain, and cyber and space, which, as I mentioned, which is very difficult to portray on a map. But air and naval power in particular are very, very important. We saw last year there were 5 carrier strike groups, allied carrier strike groups, 2 US, British, an Italian and a French in the Mediterranean, all of which came under the command of SACA for the first time. The UK, HMS Queen Elizabeth was involved in the exercise Steadfast Defender in Northern Europe. And so too for air power, NATO has strengthened its air policing mission, which polices the skies in Eastern Europe, and its air shielding, which is its integrated air and missile defence mission, which also includes fast jets who provide an air defence role too. So absolutely critical, as well as cyber and space.
I'll note for you, Sean, that my formal title is the Research Professor of JIM Security Studies, and the J in that acronym is joint. So I can speak a little bit to the realms of my Air Force and Navy colleagues. I think it's absolutely critical. Certainly the air power element is absolutely critical, right? We don't talk enough about that in this war. I think, Max, because you're exactly right, it's not been a main feature of this conflict that we're seeing unfold in Europe. And that speaks to, I think, your previous question, really, which is what lessons are we learning about the future of conflict in Europe, about operations? Because we see that we've tried to convey to the Ukrainians, the kind of multi-domain, or at least joint, maybe not multi-domain, but joint maneuver warfare, the kind that we use in the West, and try to teach that to Ukrainians. But we know they've struggled in implementing that, frankly, been unable to. At the same time, the Russians aren't very good at this, right? They're not very good at joint operations either. And so it's become a land power slog. Nonetheless, we in the West, we can use these tools, and we would in a fight with Russia, right? So we have to be careful not to draw the wrong lessons, whatever those may be, from this current conflict in terms of how we both shape our forces in Europe and the operational concepts we will then exercise through things like Steadfast Defender. I would draw your viewers' attention to the work of a former Army War College colleague, and that's Steve Biddle. He's done a lot of work on this area of what lessons can we draw from the operations currently, what's applicable to us in the West, and what's not. And one of his key takeaways is that we're not going to be able to tech innovate our way through our war with the Russians, because we see this unfolding on the battlefield, even in the limited domain, the land domain of the war right now, where one side introduces some innovation, and within a month, it's countered by the other side. So that kind of adaptation is going to occur. So we need to be careful how willing we are to rely upon our tech advantage, especially in the air domain.
But the answer is drone swarms, right?
Maybe.
Well, there are a lot of lessons from UASs in the war, both in terms of operational utility, but also for the industrial base. A lot of those smaller drones are dual-use items, so if If China floods Russia with DJI drones, I mean, those are notionally commercial items, but you know, do they make their way to the battlefield? I would be very surprised if not. For one thing we haven't really hit upon today is, you know, we've been talking a lot about Ukraine and its the support that its allies and partners are giving it to sustain its fight against Russia, but much less so against Russia's new strategy to engage allies and partners. Of course, its allies are North Korea, Iran, and China, but they each bring particular strengths, and China in particular is the factory of the world. So we have to remember that that Ukraine is not alone in its ability to stand up to its adversary through the use through the benefit of close partnerships. And that's something that's really changed a lot over the course of the war. You know, when Russia attacked Ukraine, its friends immediately stood up to help it, and over time, Russia has engaged with its partners in an increasing way.
No, just a quick anecdote on your point about needing to kind of rely on some of the commercial sector. I was just in Norway, and there the undersea capabilities of the Norwegian oil and gas sector, at least in terms of vessels, far outweigh what the actual Norwegian Navy has, because you have the commercial side investing in capabilities so that they can do work and other things undersea, and those are capabilities that could be leveraged. In the few minutes we have left, I want to talk about the China question and how China will be treated at the NATO summit, and whether the China is something that Europeans should be thinking about or preparing for, and if so, what does that even mean? Because it does seem that Europe has this threat of Russia right on its proverbial doorstep. And so the U.S. sort of insistence on, well, we have this threat in the Indo-Pacific and China. What does that actually mean? For Europe, is it more about preparing for a potential decrease in U.S. presence and pulling assets out? How do we think about the China challenge when it comes to NATO, and how should European countries in particular be thinking about this? John, maybe I'll start with you. I'll put you on the hot seat first.
Max, I think there are three ways in which Europe needs to be concerned about this. The first is the most direct one, most obvious one, and that is Chinese aid and assistance to Russia in its military war and its efforts against Ukraine. Right? The Chinese think there's a red line of providing completed systems to Russia, and they're okay with giving raw materials and precursors. I think the Europeans need to draw back that red line to limit Chinese assistance. That's the first aspect. The second is also fairly obvious, but most European politicians don't want to admit it, and that's the way in which China is a threat in Europe to Europeans today, principally through cyber, but also through other hybrid means. European politicians and publics are spied upon and attacked on a daily basis, and yet that doesn't get enough attention from our European colleagues. And the third and final way is, as you mentioned, if America is drawn into a conflict in the Indo-Pacific theater, the Europeans have to be prepared for the Americans to draw out those assets that would be useful in both theaters. That's probably not armored brigades, but it probably is refuelers, air missile defense, long-range artillery, and a couple of other systems that Europeans will need to then provide.
I'd like to add a fourth one, which is China's economic warfare. It's showed that it's been willing to withhold raw materials and other components from places where it wants to have a strategic effect, which has included European companies and European countries. So that also needs attention, and Europe needs to develop approaches to counter that as well.
Yeah, well, look, I think we've set some kind of a record here, a conversation about defense and security in Washington, D.C., and we're nearly an hour deep into this, and we've only just mentioned China. Clearly, it's going to be high up on the summit agenda. The summit is in Washington, and the US's number one defense and security priority is the pacing threat of China. The threat that China, under the CCP, poses to the world, the kind of rules-based world order as we know it. For NATO, look, NATO's defence and deterrence, what we've been talking about today, it's not aimed at China. It's not aimed at the Indo-Pacific stability and security. It's about security. The clue's in the name, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's about peace through strength, deterring a newly aggressive and revisionist Russian Federation. At the same time, as John and Cynthia have well said, China is a problem for NATO allies. NATO is not going to the Indo-Pacific, to China, but China is coming to Europe and is posing serious security threats, economic, cyber, bullying, intimidation, general principles under which European and NATO allies thrive: freedom of navigation, free trade, free and open trade, the ability to exist, sovereign nations to exist without threats of peaceful reunification or whatever it may be. So that's why China was in the NATO strategic concept in 2022 and will be high on the agenda this week for sure.
I would maybe just add one additional point, that I think that the European defense industrial capacity in the event of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific would be exceedingly useful potentially to the U.S., as we would be under strain as well. Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. John, I want to thank you so much for coming. I want to thank the two of the authors of this excellent report, Cynthia and Sean, for being here. You can download it. Is NATO Ready for War? It's available right now online. I think from this conversation, is NATO ready for war? Yes, but there's still a lot more to do. Thank you so much for joining us online. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take out your phones and subscribe to some of our podcasts, in particular the Eurofile, where we have conversations like this, and also the Eurofile sister podcast, Russian Roulette. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.